families of Dom and Davia. I'm so deeply sorry. I'm so sorry. I don't know if there's a proper way to make this apology because there are not even words to describe the guilt and remorse.
They say death row is meant for adults, for those who commit the kind of crimes too dark to forgive. But it twists into something far more disturbing when the faces behind those crimes are still young, some barely in their teens. And the acts, they're not just brutal, they're chilling enough to make your skin crawl. What pushes a child that far? Is it thrill, curiosity, or something colder? Prepare to descend into the darkest corners of teenage violence. These are the 11 youngest people sentenced to death row in the U.S. Number 11, George Stine Jr.
76 years ago, the execution of a young black teen made history in South Carolina.
He was just 14, barely a teenager, but in the eyes of the law, George Stine might as well have been a grown man, not for what he did, but for what they said he did. 2 young white girls were found dead in a ditch, and before the dirt could even settle over their graves, George was named the monster behind it.
They had no choice in how they died, and he did, and I think that justice was served according to the laws in 1944 when this happened.
83 days. That's all it took. From accusation to execution. No attorney, no parents, no real evidence. Just a boy, alone, scared, and swallowed whole by a system that never gave him a chance to speak.
During the trial, his attorney called no witnesses, asked no questions, and filed no appeal.
It happened in the town of Alcalu, South Carolina, on March 10, 1944. Betty June Binnicker was 11. Mary Emma Timms, just 7. Their bodies were found near the railroad tracks, their skulls crushed by a railroad spike. The town wanted justice fast. And George? He had been the last to see them alive. They had asked him where to find passion flowers. That small exchange was all it took for suspicion to turn into blame.
But the girls' family members, the 2 victims in this case, they still believe he was guilty.
No real investigation followed, no fingerprints, no weapon, just a hasty arrest and an even hastier trial. It lasted 2.5 hours. The jury, all white, all male, needed only 10 minutes to decide George's fate, 10 minutes to take a life. On June 16, 1994, George was strapped into an electric chair built for grown men. He was so small they had to stack Bibles beneath him just to make the straps fit, and then they flipped the switch. The youngest person executed in the U.S. during the 20th century. Just like that, he was gone. For decades, the story was buried, just another closed case, another black body lost to time. But 70 years later, the past clawed its way back. New evidence came forward, witnesses re-examined, and finally, in 2014, a judge overturned the conviction, called it what it truly was, a great injustice. But by then, it was too late. The damage had been done. An innocent child had been erased.
George Stine could not have committed these murders, but I don't think George Stine was the last person to see those children.
George Stine became more than a name. He became a symbol, a haunting reminder of what happens when fear and prejudice replace justice. And the real killer? Still unknown. Still free, and still out there. Number 10, Johnny Frank Garrett. You ever hear a story so twisted it leaves your stomach in knots? Not because it's gory, though this one definitely is, but because the truth gets messier the deeper you dig. That's what happened in Amarillo, Texas on Halloween morning, 1981. The convent of St. Francis was supposed to be a place of peace, a sanctuary. But that morning, it became a crime scene soaked in horror. Inside, they found the body of 76-year-old Sister Tadia Benz, beaten, assaulted, left like some discarded thing. She wasn't just killed, she was violated in a way that made even seasoned detectives look away. And just like that, the quiet little neighborhood wasn't so quiet anymore. Sirens screamed through the streets, doors were locked, curtains drawn, and everywhere, one question echoed louder than the rest. Who could do something like this? It didn't take long for the police to come knocking across the street. That's where they found 17-year-old Johnny Frank Garrett, shy, withdrawn, practically invisible if you weren't looking for him. He lived just feet away from the convent, and on the surface, he didn't seem like a monster. But behind that awkward smile was a storm. Years of abuse, trauma, and pain nobody wanted to talk about. Until now. The evidence came in hard and fast. Fingerprints, a kitchen knife that matched the wounds, and a witness who claimed they saw him running from the scene. On November 9th, Garrett was arrested. Rape and murder conviction followed like clockwork. But here's where it gets murky. Even with all the evidence stacked high, Johnny never confessed. He swore he was innocent right up to the end, and that claim would go on to stir one of the most controversial cases in Texas history. He was sentenced to death. Death for a crime that he insisted he didn't commit. For years he sat on death row, watching time run out, until, out of nowhere, a voice from the Vatican stepped in. Pope John Paul II himself pleaded for mercy. And for a second, it looked like that prayer had worked. Texas Governor Ann Richards granted a temporary reprieve. One more breath, one more day. But mercy doesn't last long in Texas. The Board of Pardons and Paroles held a vote, 17-1, not in his favor. No commutation, no life sentence, just death. Scheduled for February 11, 1992. He was 28. When they asked what he wanted for his final meal, he didn't ask for steak or lobster. He asked for ice cream. Just that. Maybe it reminded him of a time before the darkness, or maybe he just stopped caring. But his final words? They were anything but sweet. The rest of the world can kiss my ever-loving IRA. Then the needle went in, and it was over. Or was it? Because years later, new evidence started to surface. Evidence that suggested maybe, just maybe, they got the wrong guy. A different suspect. A new story. But Sister Tadia was still gone. And Garrett? Well, he'd already paid the price, whether he was guilty or not. While Garrett's death toll may be filled with controversy, the next sure felt a lot more like justice. Number 9. Shawn Sellers. On a quiet night in Oklahoma City, March 5, 1986, something unthinkable unfolded behind the doors of a modest family home.
The bodies had been discovered by Vonda's 16-year-old son, Shawn, who said he'd called in after staying the night with a friend.
16-year-old Shawn Sellers crept through the shadows, barefoot, dressed in nothing but his underwear, a .44 caliber revolver gripped in his hand. His mother and stepfather slept soundly. One by one, he pulled the trigger, calm, methodical. No panic, no regret. By the time the gun fell silent, 2 lives had been stolen in their own bed. And with chilling calculation, Shawn staged the scene to look like a burglary gone wrong. But this wasn't some impulsive crime of passion. It was premeditated and fueled by something far darker. People would later ask, what could push such an ordinary-looking teenager to kill his own flesh and blood in such a cold-blooded way? The answer lay in Shawn's growing obsession with Satanism.
He wanted to learn more about demons. He wanted to learn more about the 4 dark forces of the world.
His life had twisted into a grim ritual of blood-drinking, whispered chants, and hours spent poring over the satanic Bible. In his eyes, murder wasn't just murder. It was devotion, a ritual, a prayer made in violence.
As I continued and got deeper into it, it eventually became an obsession with me and then definitely took control of my life.
But this wasn't Shawn's his first kill. 6 months earlier, September 8th, 1985, he shot and killed Robert Paul Bauer, a 32-year-old Circle K clerk. The reason? The man refused to sell beer to Shawn's friend. Sellers confessed later, admitting he'd done it simply to know what it feels like to kill somebody. But his cruelty didn't end there. Days before killing his parents, Shawn had secretly laced his mother's coffee with rat poison just because she disapproved of his girlfriend. The reckoning, however, came fast.
That his mother, Wanda, must die. It's just how to do it.
On March 6, 1986, barely 24 hours after the double murder, Shawn was arrested. In court, his lawyer claimed Sellers was possessed by a demon named Ezrade. There was even talk of Dungeons & Dragons addiction driving him to madness. But the jury wasn't buying it. Shawn Sellers was found guilty of multiple murders and sentenced to death that same year. As years passed, Shawn publicly declared he'd found Christianity, appeared on television expressing remorse, begging for clemency through his newfound faith.
That you would choose people who didn't give to society anything.
But nothing changed the outcome. On February 4th, 1999, Shawn Sellers was executed by lethal injection. For his last meal, he chose Chinese food, egg rolls, sweet and sour shrimp, and batter-fried shrimp. For some, his death marked justice served. But the next case that would grip the public's attention wasn't about a killer. It was about an innocent boy whose life was stolen in an entirely different kind of tragedy. Number 8. Douglas Christopher Thomas. It started like any teenage love story, all late-night calls, secret notes, and promises whispered in the dark.
My wallet, thank God.
I thought you might need that.
You saved my life. $10, right?
Oh, yeah.
But somewhere along the way, what should have been innocent affection twisted into something tragic. And in the end, 2 people were dead, and a 17-year-old boy stood at the center of it all, with blood on his hands and love as his only defense. Douglas Christopher Thomas wasn't a troublemaker. He was shy, quiet, the kind of kid who blended into the background. He had no record, no history of violence, but he carried the kind of loneliness you can't always see, the kind that eats at you from the inside. That was, until he met Jessica Wiseman. She was 14, young, hopeful, and just as desperate to be understood. For Douglas, she became everything, a reason to breathe. But not everyone saw it that way, especially her parents.
As long as you live in my house, you will follow my rules.
But why do you have to humiliate me?
At first, the Wisemans just disapproved. But disapproval turned into control. Control turned into punishment. And before long, Jessica was trapped in her own home, grounded, silenced, and stripped of any freedom. She started talking about running away, about escape, about how love was the only thing she had left. And Douglas listened. On November 10th, 1990, with nothing but a gun and Jessica by his side, he stepped into her family's home. A plan was already in motion, but love doesn't always think straight, especially when it's young and desperate. Within seconds, the gun went off. Kathy and James Wiseman were shot at close range. The sound of those bullets echoed through more than just the house. It shattered 2 families forever. Reality came crashing in fast.
No. My parents always got along.
Any problems drinking, gambling?
No, never.
The plan unraveled. The fantasy dissolved. Douglas was arrested almost immediately, and when the time came, he didn't run from it. He confessed, said he did it for love, that he thought it was the only way they could be free. But the jury didn't see a lovesick boy. They saw a killer.
All I'm saying is that Jennifer Stanton, this was completely her idea.
Despite pleas of youth, trauma, and mental immaturity, Douglas was sentenced to death. And on January 10, 2000, at just 26 years old, Douglas Christopher Thomas was executed by lethal injection, one of the last Americans put to death for a crime committed as a juvenile. But even now, decades later, one question still hangs heavy in the air. Was this justice? Or just another child swallowed by a system that never gave him the space to grow up? Number 7. Christa Pike. You ever see a teenager so angry, so wild-eyed you can't tell if it's just hormones or something much darker? That was Christa Gale Pike. On the surface, just another troubled 17-year-old, reckless, defiant, maybe a little lost. But underneath that tough exterior was something far more dangerous. By the time she turned 18, Christa wouldn't just be another statistic. She'd become the youngest woman sentenced to death in modern U.S. history.
Christa Pike wants her death sentence reconsidered.
She shouldn't have any appeals. Her appeals were done 2 years ago.
The story the public got was simple: a love triangle gone wrong. A jealous girl, a boyfriend, a rival, and one brutal night that ended in blood. But the truth? It's messier than that. To understand how it all spiraled, we have to rewind to where the chaos really began. Christa's life was never built on solid ground. Born into a storm, abuse, neglect, trauma. She was molested, unwanted, and already flirting with death before most kids even learn how to drive. By the time she hit her teens, she was sent to the Job Corps Center in Knoxville, Tennessee, a government-run program meant to set kids straight. From the outside, it looked like things were finally turning around. But that was just the mask. The real Christa was still simmering beneath the surface, waiting to explode.
Pike was 18 years old at the time of the killing. Her lawyers say her brain wasn't fully developed.
And then came Tatterell Shipp, a boy just a year younger and just as lost. The two became inseparable, bonded by obsession, rebellion, and a growing fascination with the occult. Together, they started to drift into a world far from reality. Darker, rituals, symbols, satanic fantasies. And when 19-year-old Colleen Slemmer entered the picture, Christa saw red. She believed Colleen was trying to steal her boyfriend. Whether that was true or not didn't matter.
She and 2 other people tortured and killed 19-year-old Colleen Slemmer.
In Christa's mind, betrayal had already happened. So she planned a little meeting, told Colleen they wanted to clear the air, squash the tension. Colleen agreed. She never saw it coming. What happened next was straight out of a nightmare. Christa and 2 others lured Colleen out to an isolated spot behind the Job Corps campus. There, Christa pounced, beating, taunting, carving. For 30 excruciating minutes, Colleen was tortured. They sliced a pentagram into her chest, then crushed her skull with a piece of asphalt. And when it was all over, Christa didn't run or hide. She bragged.
That's the reaction of Colleen Slemmer's mother to a recent request from her daughter's killer.
walked through the halls like a queen of cruelty, flashing a piece of the victim's skull like a trophy. But the law moved fast. Within 36 hours, Christa was in cuffs. She later confessed without hesitation and was charged with first-degree murder and conspiracy.
The only woman on Tennessee's death row is asking the courts to reconsider her death sentence.
On March 30th, 1996, she was sentenced to death by electrocution, plus 25 years for the plot behind it all. To this day, she sits on death row, Tennessee's only female inmate awaiting execution. Number 6. Toronto Patterson. Toronto Patterson didn't just drift into crime, he wore it like a skin. With drug smuggling already staining his name, he was deep in the game by 15, flashing gang ties like they were badges of honor. But what began as survival quickly twisted into greed, and by 17, that hunger for more would leave 3 people dead. It happened on June 6, 1995.
Knoxville police quickly dispelled any myths about the case with a break in their investigation.
Patterson had grown obsessed with cars, especially the kind that turned heads. Golden rims, flashy bodies. One in particular caught his eye, a BMW owned by his cousin, Kimberly Brewer. That day, he showed up at her house with a decision already made. Moments later, Kimberly and her daughters, 3-year-old Ollie and 6-year-old Jennifer, were shot in the head, execution style. Just like that, they were gone. No warning, no mercy.
Police say the murder suspects were close to the victim.
The motive of the crime appears to be a love triangle.
With their bodies still inside, Patterson took 3 wheels off the BMW and fled. He hid the tires at his girlfriend's house with the hope of selling it off and ditched his clothes, thinking he was in the clear. But luck wasn't on his side. That same evening, police tracked him down and made the arrest. At first, he tried spinning a story, claiming 2 unknown Jamaicans were behind the murders. But the evidence told a different tale. Bloodied clothes, stolen rims, a timeline he couldn't outrun. Faced with the truth, he confessed.
Authorities say students and faculty should always exercise caution, especially at night in areas like this.
Convicted of 3 counts of capital murder, Patterson was sentenced to death later that year, and in August 2002, at the age of 24, he was executed by lethal injection. His final meal was simple: fried chicken, chef salad, soda, and cake. His last words were an apology, but even then, he denied pulling the trigger. He admitted to the theft, but not the killings. The families never believed him, not after what he left behind. Number 5. Charles Rumball. There are some lives that seem wired for destruction from the very start. For Charles Rumball, that destruction didn't creep in. It stormed through the door early. He wasn't even a teenager when he began holding people at gunpoint. Reform schools became routine, jail cells familiar. By the time he turned 17, he wasn't just another troubled kid. He was a young man walking a path straight toward death row. April 4th, 1975. That was the day things went too far. Charles entered a jewelry store owned by 58-year-old Michael Fiorillo. He came armed and ready, demanding money. But Fiorillo wasn't about to give in. He reached for a weapon, and in that split-second standoff, a shot rang out. Just one bullet, and Fiorillo hit the floor, dead. Realizing how far he'd gone, Charles took off, thinking he could leave the wreckage behind him. But he didn't make it far. The next day, police tracked him down, gun still in hand, threatening to shoot it out with officers. He dared them to pull the trigger, but they didn't. He was arrested, alive, but broken. Within a month, the weight of it all hit hard. 3 suicide attempts followed. He slit his wrist, took an overdose, tried anything to escape what was coming. None of it worked. In April 1976, the verdict came in. Guilty of murder, death sentence. And then came the long, slow march of time, nearly 10 years on death row, waiting for the end. It came on September 11th, 1985. Charles was 28, executed by lethal injection. His final meal? A single flour tortilla. No feast, no last indulgence. Just a plain ending to a life that had burned out before it even had a chance to begin. He became the first juvenile offender in 21 years to be executed in the United States. Number 4. Christopher Lee Simmons. Under the cover of night before the sun rose on September 9th, 1993, in Fenton, Missouri, 17 years old, Christopher Simmons and Benjamin sneaked through the window into their neighbor's house, convinced they could run away with murder. Their goal was simple: to carry out a kidnapping that will forever tie them to the world of crime.
Told you last night, it happened right on the victim's own front porch. Fox 2's Chris Hayes has new details and reaction.
Once inside, the night turned darker. They restrained Shirley Crook with duct tape, forced her into her minivan, and drove for 25 minutes to Castlewood State Park. There they carried out their brutal plan. Crook was still alive when they hurtled her over the bridge and dumped her into the river below, leaving her to fight for her life until she eventually drowned. After leaving Crook to drown, they ran away, thinking their cruel act was buried under the darkness of the night. Their minds too young to understand the weight of what they've done. To them, it was just a plan they pulled off, a fascination that became their reality. But how could two teenagers believe they could run away from murder? What made it even more heartless was how they bragged to their friends about their heinous crimes the very next day, instead of hiding it. Not long after, police stormed the school, arresting the young criminals. That was the moment Simmons knew offenses came with repercussions, and when interrogated by authorities, he gave a tearful confession to his crimes. In 1994, Simmons was found guilty of first-degree murder despite the positive testimony given by his family and friends. However, over the next several years, the legal battle shifted from the crime itself into a case that would change history. The state began to put into consideration if executing someone for a crime they committed when they were a minor was right. This turned into a legal battle, and after several appeals, luck was on his side. On August 26, 2003, the Supreme Court threw out his death sentence and later resentenced him to life without the possibility of parole. Number 3. Napoleon Beasley. On April 19, 1994, a casual night out with his friends soon turned into an impromptu car heist, ultimately ending the life of a 63-year-old man. Born on August 5, 1976, in Grapeland, Texas, Beasley had always been a great student. He was a star athlete, a class president, and had a promising future. All that changed the moment he decided to carry out a heinous crime that will bring a halt to his future. After unsuccessfully trying to carjack a Lexus, Beasley and his friends, 19-year-old Cedric and 18-year-old Donald, spotted a 1987 Mercedes-Benz driven by John Luddig with his wife sitting by his side. Trailing behind them, Beasley later came out of the car when the Luddig couple stopped at their home.
And I had doubts, but it's a helpless feeling that you have, and you're standing there behind the glass.
Armed with a .45 caliber pistol he got from his mother, Beasley fired the shot at John, killing him in his garage. He then turned the gun on his wife, although he missed her, and she fell to the ground. He took the car and fled the scene. A few weeks later, all three were apprehended and finally faced charges. Despite Beasley being a 17-year-old boy, he was tried as an adult.
Determining Napoleon's fate today, but tomorrow you don't know who's going to determine yours.
And in 1995, he was finally convicted and sentenced to death. And what followed was several years of appeal, but all turned to deaf ears. Originally set for reprieve on August 2001, the Texas Court of Appeal unexpectedly granted him a last-minute stay just 4 hours before his death sentence. But the reprieve didn't last. In May 2002, Beasley was executed by lethal injection at 25 years old with no final words and no final meals. Number 2. Scott Hayne. With no plans of showing mercy, 17-year-old Scott Hayne and 21-year-old Robert Lambert carried out a crime so brutal that it has left many speechless. It was on a cold night of October 6, 1987, in Tulsa, Oklahoma, when Hayne and Lambert went looking for victims, not out of desperation or robbery, but out of thrill. And soon they found their suspects, 21-year-old Laura Sanders and 27-year-old Michael Houghton. Hayne and Lambert approached the couple's car, pretending to be in need of help, and that was when they struck. They robbed the couple and forced them into the back seat of the car. One would have expected this to be their only form of brutality. But no. The pair left Tulsa and drove to an isolated place just at the outskirts of town. There, the couple was ordered into the trunk of the car. Hayne retrieved a container of gasoline and set the car on fire. As the flame ignited, the couple burned alive, and the two teens fled the scene, satisfied with their actions. 3 days later, Hayne and Lambert were arrested and charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder, kidnapping, and robbery. And in 1988, Hayne was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to death by lethal injection. Trying to fight his fate, Scott spent the years of his death row pleading for appeal.
At the resentencing hearing, the new jury again sentenced Hayne to death for the murder.
However, all of Hayne's subsequent appeals were eventually dismissed. On April 3, 2003, nearly 15 years after he was convicted at the age of 32, Scott Hayne was executed by lethal injection. His last meal was 3 cheeseburgers, ice cream, and a slush drink. He left with no final words. However, in March 2005, less than 2 years after Hayne's execution, the United States Supreme Court ruled in Roper versus Simmons. Had the ruling come earlier, Hayne would not have died by lethal injection. Instead, he became the last person executed in the United States for crimes committed as a juvenile. Number 1. Shaka Sanca. Born Gary Lee Graham, Sanca went down in history as a martyr instead of a criminal. On May 13, 1981, the dead body of Bobby Lambert was found in a Safeway parking lot, killed by a single shot fired at close range. This death, one filled with mystery, was later traced to 17-year-old Sanca, who was known as a street thug in Texas, and the main reason why was the several similar crimes he had pulled off.
Claiming Graham was not the gunman who killed a man outside a Houston supermarket.
Because days after Lambert's untimely death, Graham committed numerous assaults and at least 10 armed robberies. One of his victims was a 57-year-old female taxi driver who was sexually assaulted. Not knowing the threat coming to him, Graham was asleep in his bed when police arrived and arrested him. When interrogated, he denied ever having a hand in the murder, but admitted to other crimes he had committed during the week-long spree. But the testimony of one eyewitness sealed his life into a death sentence. And what followed after were several attempts to get an appeal, escaping his execution 5 times, once in 1987 and 3 times in 1993. He soon became an activist, apologizing verbally and in writing to the victims of these crimes. In 1995, he changed his name from Gary Lee Graham to Shaka Sanca. However, the 2000 presidential election soon made Graham a martyr, and a campaign began, which soon caught international attention, arguing that his conviction was only based on a single eyewitness. After almost 2 decades of failed appeals, when the time finally came for him to be taken to the death chamber, Sanca resisted.
Dozens of people demonstrated outside the Texas State Attorney General's office today in protest of plans to execute convicted murderer Gary Graham.
A cell extraction team was sent to force him towards the death chamber. It took 5 jail guards to strap him to the gurney before he was finally executed by lethal injection. If this story fascinates you, share your thoughts below and subscribe to join us as we explore more secrets behind criminal minds. Thanks for watching. See you next time.